Like many of the heavily modified locomotives produced by MLW for the Canadian market only, the MLW RS10 was not designed to be a looker. It was not designed to be something that would catch someone's eye. Rather, it was designed to be a practical solution, like many of MLW's designs, to the harsh Canadian winter climate. The Alco RS3 was the American Locomotive Company's most successful road switcher locomotive, with a total of 1,418 units produced. This Alco locomotive model and its predecessor models from Alco's new road switcher or RS series of locomotives represented a revolution for a locomotive that couldn't just only do locals as well as switching runs, but could also handle long mainline freights as well as passenger trains, as well as more local passenger trains and commuter runs, while at the same time not giving up its ability to do switch jobs as well as run local freights. One could say Alco had managed to pull off a coup with this model, getting in before General Motors, who had long since regarded this particular locomotive, which had been requested by the Rock Island Railroad, as apparently being unnecessary or at least not worth General Motors' own time and effort to build. Luckily for the Rock Island Railroad, when they approached Alco about this particular concept, Alco disagreed, and by simply extending the frame on its S-series of switchers long enough to actually install road trucks as well as a small hood on the front, they were able to accomplish all the specifications the Rock Island wanted, with the exception of possibly not quite enough horsepower. The resulting model of locomotive being known as the Alco RS1. Once it became clear that this new type of locomotive represented not only a new market but possibly a revolution in terms of North American locomotives eventually to be known as the road switcher, Alco swiftly ramped up production to get the locomotives into its customers' hands as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, these first engines would never actually get into the hands of customers, as they were all quote-unquote drafted into the war effort, running on the Trans-Iranian Railway and being placed on six-axle trucks. Once the war came to a close, however, Alco successfully restarted commercial manufacture for railroads of the Alco RS1, as well as dealt with the issues with lack of horsepower with its new but flawed prime mover called the 244, resulting in the model Alco RS2, and then its evolution, the Alco RS3. The end result, however, was a revolution in which GM would wind up playing catch-up, although successfully, with its models GP7 and eventually 9. While the locomotive sold well in the States in particular, it can also be easily argued that the 244 power plant, which was known for breaking its crankshaft, not to mention suffering from several mechanical issues brought on by quality control and design issues that were not detected by the prime mover's designers and developers, due to the rush to get the 244 power plant into service, affected this locomotive's ability to sell even more units in the United States. That said, the RS3 proved very popular as an export locomotive, so much so that Alco's wholly owned subsidiary, called MLW or the Montreal Locomotive Works, began to build this locomotive under license in Canada as was. The RS3, despite its troubles in 244, actually performed much better up north. There are several plausible explanations for this. The most notable one is the fact that the subcontractor in Canada that produced the prime mover for MLW or the Montreal Locomotive Works kept a much closer eye on the prime movers being produced for their particular locomotives, ensuring that they were produced to the proper production standards and thus lessening issues with the 244's design flaws. While the very flexible RS3s were very practical for the Canadian environment of the time, with more and more westward expansion and the need to get both passengers and freight traffic transferred in an inexpensive manner with a locomotive that could essentially do it all, these locomotives, much like other designs of locomotives that were produced under license in Canada, suffered from problems that normally wouldn't have come up in their home countries/regions, mainly due to the extreme difference in weather conditions up in the Great White North, with temperatures easily dropping several degrees below zero in Fahrenheit on cold winter's days, and snow that's measured in feet, not inches, made the somewhat rough and ready body designs of the RS3, which is again derived from Alco's own S-series of switchers, less practical in these extreme conditions, causing things like bells and outside mechanical devices to freeze, as well as making it hard to access the prime mover, which would again require the crew to walk outside, specifically along a slippery catwalk that ran the length of the locomotive to get access to certain components to work on the engine, difficult to do when you're in the middle of an extreme blizzard or if the locomotive is covered with feet of snow. and so MLW, the fully owned subsidiary of the American Locomotive Company, decided to design a practical solution to this problem. Due to a lack of budget and time, this particular locomotive would utilize all of the components of the Alco RS3. The most notable difference in this locomotive was essentially a new pair of clothes, if you will, that it would wear, in the form of a body that would cover everything, including the engine room, allowing easier access to things like the belt, which would be placed on the end of the long hood, the dynamic brakes, as well as the prime mover itself in extreme conditions, as well as protecting those particular pieces of equipment from the extreme weather, and thus improving the locomotive's reliability in such extreme conditions. Like its close cousin, the Alco RS3, despite its looks, this particular locomotive was designed to be dual mode, that is to say capable of hauling passengers as well as freight, and so steam generator equipment would be housed in the short hood, but as an added bonus, one could also install dynamic brakes in addition to the steam generator in this place, unlike most Alco RS3s unless they were modified to the infamous, or rather famous, depending upon your opinion, hammerhead model. The squared-off body of the RS10 is again not a looker. However, look closely and you'll note that there are a lot of similarities to later models, including the model that would eventually succeed it called the RS18, as well as its American cousin, the Alco RS11. Again, the most notable traits between its direct predecessor, the MLW RS10, is the placement of the vents for cooling as well as the aftercooler vents, and the fact that the short hood of the MLW RS18 is in fact shorter than that of the RS10. While one might think that all the designers did of the Alco RS11 in America was to simply take this design, essentially stuff their components in, and notch the hoods off, the Alco RS11 is in fact a shortened version of the Alco RSD7 body which debuted on that locomotive back in 1954. The D7 is notable as it was the last new model introduced with the Alco 244 type power plant, although a much more modified and reliable version of it, known as the H variant, with a heavily updated crankshaft crankcase, an all-new version of the 710 turbocharger, or prime mover, that would eventually spawn what would become the 250 prime mover, which Alco would begin to drop in as a warranty replacement for its unreliable 244s. While this locomotive proved much more practical than the RS3 was, it wasn't the biggest seller in the world for MLW, with only 129 units produced. There were several different reasons for that. Let's start with, there again was that elephant in the room, the infamous 244 prime mover, which once placed in this particular shell apparently didn't play very nice compared to how it did in the RS3 shell, suffering cooling issues and the usual broken crankshafts. Effectively and ironically, by having a body that fully enclosed the locomotive protecting it from the elements, the same lack of colder temperature apparently began to accentuate the cooling issues in which U.S. railroads had suffered with the sister engine, the RS3. But perhaps the most notable factor in this particular locomotive's production was succession, that in the form of the Alco 251, which would enter production in a sister locomotive built by the American Locomotive Company called the RS11 in 1957. The MLW RS10 was then discontinued and succeeded by the MLW RS18. While many in era have come to the conclusion that the MLW RS18 was effectively a very simple redesign from the Alco RS10 due to their similarities, this of course is not true. The area in which the prime mover mounts up to the frame of the RS18 had to be widened to accommodate the 251. Also, the doors had to be changed to allow for the access to the new locomotive's actual prime mover, and the whole design had to be shifted down from the front of the cab to enable the still 12-cylinder 251 to fit in the same space the 12-cylinder version of the 244 had occupied. The intercooler posed a particular issue, forcing the battery boxes to be moved further back in the locomotive to accommodate it. This also necessitated the movement of the exhaust staff slightly further aft. Sadly, none of these locomotives are currently in operation. But few examples of these locomotives to survive the times continue to live on in rail museums such as Expo Rail up in Canada. Now, while one might consider this locomotive merely a footnote in that of the long history of building locomotives from Alco and MLW alike, it in fact set the company up for its new path forward, with the enclosed body type having at least some effect on the developers and or designers of the Alco RSD7. And from this point forward, all of Alco's road switchers, whether being produced under license by MLW or specifically by MLW or by Alco itself, would feature a similar body design, allowing for more space for components inside to protect them from the elements. This influence would last far into the modern era, with special versions of EMD as well as GE locomotives featuring these fully protective enclosed bodies for a more weatherproofed, if you will, experience by the crew in case anything went wrong with mechanics in severe storms up in the Great White North. And that's going to do it for this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If not, thumbs down. Please like and subscribe and comment. And as always, keep the metal side down.